and welcome to Talking Stand Firm. I'm Jake McCandless with Stand Firm Ministries, and it's only me today. I know, I'm sorry. Unfortunately, you're just stuck with me. Unfortunately, Cherrilynn had a family friend, uh, had a loss in their family. We're going to be praying for her. I'm going to lift her up in prayer in just a few minutes, but I just want to welcome you to Talking Stand Firm. So I'm behind the controls and trying to talk for two people. So it's going to be terrible, but I'm glad that you're here. And so we're going to give it a try. I like with Cherrilynn leading because I'm just able to sit back, drink some coffee, and maybe push a few buttons. So we're going to get this thing rolling. And so if you're here live, we're going to be taking questions here on Facebook. And we're also on YouTube today for the first time. And so you can also, I think, ask questions there. And we should be able to see it. It should be coming through good and coming through well for that. And so we're also on a new platform today. So we're giving it a try to stand firm. And I mean, just, yeah, I'm stand firm to StreamYard. And so giving that a shot. So let me know how that goes. And we'll give that a chance and see what's going on with that. We've been using Zoom. And Zoom, I'm sorry, you've not been coming through for us. And so we said goodbye. We'll see if we're saying goodbye forever. So I hope you caught the live message last night, session 2 of the You Are Here conference. I hope that you caught it. And that's what we're doing today. We follow up from the presentation the night before, answer questions, take questions, interact with that, interacting again here on the Stand Firm Ministries page and in the comments below and on our YouTube channel as well. So you have an opportunity to give questions, especially pertaining to the presentation last night, but it's open to really anything. But we say anything along the lines of standing firm and remaining faithful. And today we have a special guest with us coming in the second half of the show, Chadwick Harvey, director of Faithful Performance Ministries and author of a couple of books, God's Prophetic Timeline and God's Fishermen, Satan's Hunters, a new book that just came out. Well, I guess it's not so new now, but it's still fresh. And so I encourage you to check that out. And also, he has just dropped a podcast. The third episode dropped today, The Final Threshold. Very great, awesome stuff. Great guest on there as well. A friend of both of ours, Daniel Seckham, was on today's that dropped just earlier. And I think I'm a guest coming up. So, yeah, he has a great choice in guest, right? So if you're here live, checking us out, if you're on the page, say hello. Let me know you're here. Let me know that I'm not alone. Hey, Cherrilynn, I miss you. This isn't fun by myself. I mean, who wants to just hear me, right? So here we go. So if you've got questions, especially coming back to the message last night, put them in the comments below, or just anything that you want to ask along the lines of remaining faithful and moving forward to the challenges ahead in upcoming prophecy. Drop them in. I'd love to hear from you. So we're going to be I want to give a overview of just where we went yesterday. But before we do, I want to open prayer and pray for Cherrilynn and her friends, friends of their family who had a loss, just a devastating loss. And so I want to lift them up. So wherever you're at, if you want to pray with me, let me pray. Father, I thank you so much for this opportunity to serve you. I want to belong to you. Father, those listening who have the privilege and the opportunity to be one of yours, to have been adopted into your family, to have the opportunity to follow you. Lord, it is such an honor. Lord, I pray that more would come into your family, more would come to follow you. Father, I thank you for the opportunity to serve you and to talk about things of your word. Father, I thank you for the friends and supporters of Stand Firm and those who will be checking this out, whether they're live today, right now, or checking us out later. Lord, I thank you for them. And Father, I pray especially for Cherrilynn right now, Lord, for the loss that their friends have had. Lord, I just pray that you put your arms around them, that even in this deep tragedy, they will know you and know your love and know your comfort. And Lord, I pray for Cherrilynn and her family and her son. as they grapple through this loss. Father, we love you. We know that our prayers are not in vain. We know that you hear us. Lord, some reason you ask us to come to you. Lord, and for some reason you care about what goes on in our lives. You want us to rely on you. And it's in these moments that we can't do anything else. And Lord, I pray that your presence will be known. Thank you for that. Father, we love you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Well, again, welcome back. Talking Stand Firm. So last night was session 2. Hey, Jesse, thanks for saying hello, for dropping in. You can't drop off now. I'll see you. No, I don't think it tells me when you drop off. But anyway, so thank you for being a part of this. So last night we had session 2 of the You Are Here conference. You Are Here. Hey, Carrie, thanks for joining us. So You Are Here is a conference, a 2-session conference, where we really just look at the biblical evidence, almost like we're taking it to court. Hey, Tamara, taking it to court. This idea of where are we in terms of the prophetic timeline? Where are we in terms? Hey, Matt over on YouTube. Good to see you. Tamara, good to see you. So, yeah, that's why I need Cherrilynn. I can't keep it straight here. So what was I talking about? So anyway, so we were talking about the You Are Here conference, 2 parts, going through, just looking at where we are. And really, I've looked at it as if you were taking it to court and you needed evidence to prove one way or the other. And there's tons of signs that Scripture gives us about what is going to happen in the last days, what's going to happen at the end of the age, signs that we can look at and we can know that are going to happen, and we can say, okay, hey, there we are, we're in the end times. But some of those signs are not measurable. Some of them are more measurable than others, and so those are the ones we're focusing on and talking about what I believe are very clear biblical evidence to where we are in this current age and where we are prophetically. And I believe we're like a GPS. We're able to sit back and say, okay, boom, this points to where we're at, which is awesome, which is so cool. So we looked in the first session at Daniel 2, which in Daniel 2, we have this itinerary of really starting from Daniel's life, from the Babylonian Empire, when Israel was there in captivity, King Nebuchadnezzar, all of that starts right there and spreads all the way to the return of Christ, which is amazing. And so theoretically, right, if you could find where you are in this itinerary, in this flow of events, then boom, you would know where you are in this current age. And we can know that fairly well. I shared a couple different views that deal with the timing, and both of them show we're way down the tracks, that it's not crazy to say, hey, we're in the last days or nearing the last days. Doesn't mean we have to be, but it definitely isn't crazy to say that we could be, according to Daniel 2. And so we looked at a second sign last night, and I've been using the example again of the GPS, of that dot. It shows where you're at, but also with the GPS, it doesn't just use one satellite to point to where we're at. Typically it's 3. I think it can be more than that. And so we need more witnesses. And Scripture says, we need 2 or 3 witnesses. You hear that a few times throughout the Scriptures. And so what are the witnesses to where we're at? Well, number 1, we looked at Daniel 2, and looked at a second, which may even be more clear, something that's happened right before our eyes, very visible. And really, to us in this generation, we don't see it as spectacular. We just understand that it's always been there. But and that's the fact of Israel returning home. It wasn't until 1948 that Israel becomes a Jewish nation. It wasn't really until recently, the early 2000s, that there were more Jewish people in the nation of Israel than other places in the world. I mean, again, happening right before our eyes, just 2019, just last year, Trump and others rally support to say that the capital of Jerusalem, a capital of Israel, is Jerusalem, and moving the embassy there of the United States. So it's something that's continually unfolding right before us. But we began with this question of looking at what's the final event. So the idea is, if we know the picture of the final event of this age, then again, theoretically, we know the pieces that have to be in place before that. So therefore, those pieces have to be coming together now. And so when those pieces are all together, we could say, well, at least the end could happen. And so what is that final picture? Well, that final picture, as we move through the final 7 years, you get to that last moment of this age. The last moment of this age is the Antichrist rallying somehow the nations, the armies of the world, rallying them around Israel with the goal to do what many have tried to do throughout history, and that's wipe Israel off the map. And as this dire situation is happening in Israel, and the Antichrist has led these armies of the world against it, they're encircled around it. That's the moment. That's the picture. That's the pivotal moment. What looks like to be the end of Israel then becomes the moment of the greatest comeback that we'll ever know. And that's Jesus returning and coming and saving the day there at the Battle of Armageddon, at the kind of the last, really the last moment there, saves his people, defeats the Antichrist, defeats the armies of the world, and what we know again is the Battle of Armageddon. And then Jesus is here, and when he comes, he brings with him the army of heaven, which we understand to be us. It's us who have been raptured if we were alive at the point of the rapture, of the resurrection, and those who are resurrected. Everyone who has been a believer up until the time Jesus returns is brought back with him, and we're there to see him win the battle and be crowned king and began his 1,000-year reign, the millennial kingdom, there in Jerusalem. So that's the moment. That's the moment that everything is building towards. And there's so many times that's been foreshadowed in Scripture. And so again, that's what we're building to. So what pieces have to be in place for that? Anybody? We got a few out there checking us out live. Come on, somebody throw some pieces in there that have to be there. I mean, one, the Antichrist has to be in power, right? The Antichrist has got to be around. Somehow he has to deceive the armies of the world to do this. And we have that in the book of Revelation. It talks about these spirits. It says they're like frogs that go out and they convince these kings of the world to come and gather, which is also interesting to note that, yes, the Antichrist is in power. Yes, he has a large empire at the end, but there are still other kings who are subdued by him, but still have some type of independence, who come and work with him here in this final battle. So those things have to take place. They have to march get to Israel for that moment. And then the one we take for granted, there has to be Jewish people in the land of Israel. Israel has to be a nation that is led by Jewish leaders. That all has to take place before the end. And it has, right? That component is there, and it's been there for a while. Again, a nation since 1948. They've had Jerusalem since 67, really allowed to come back into the land, trickled back into the land since 1917 with the Balfour Declaration. So, I mean, it's in place and it's happening. It's just continuing to unfold right before our eyes. And so with that being the case, that is a clear sign that we have seen unfolded. Now, again, how many have to return to Israel before this happens? Now, right now, we know that more than any other one place in the world, Israel has the highest population of Jewish people. That's just recent. I mean, really, just in the last couple of decades, that has happened. So there's not a whole lot left for that to happen. And so we look at that. So we say, okay, Daniel 2 points that we're in this possibility to say we're near the end. And then we look at what's happened with Israel returning. And then we throw in the other signs that maybe aren't measurable. The fact that there will be earthquakes, the fact that the world will continue to be more sinful, that people who profess Christ will turn away from the truth, that people who profess Christ will turn away, that there will be false teaching that rises up. I mean, so all these things that are very true signs that are occurring, when you get them also linked up. And so that's why I use the example of the satellite. You've got, at least three, this triangulation that's pointing and intersecting at one place. You got to say, well, this must be something to this. And then that's what we see. Every sign that Scripture gives, other than some very specific signs that really happen in an instant or near instant. So when we talk about Daniel 2, all that's left is that statue, this division of 10 that's represented through the toes, and then Daniel 7 represented through the horns of that final beast, this division of 10 that goes down to 4 or 3 and then to 1, which is the Antichrist. It's all that has to happen in that Daniel 2, and that's a very short time frame in which that could happen. In regards to Israel returning, there is going to be a rebuilding of the temple. But again, that does not have to happen before the start of the 7 years. And really all that we're waiting for there is the Antichrist, or his out of his empire, for him to make this covenant with Israel to start that 7-year time clock. So we're there, and then you see so many other signs being fulfilled. So I give this and share this in churches as you are here. But if I ever get the chance to speak at a prophecy event, I change the title to "You Ain't Crazy," because I don't believe that you're crazy to say we're near the end, because there is such evidence out there. And that's why I'm devoting so much time and so much in my life to make that point, to share this point. It's because my role as a Bible teacher is to accurately teach the word, to divide it correctly. And the best interpretations, again, of Daniel 2, Daniel 7, of this prophecy that's on the lips of every prophet, we see over and over again that Israel would be ultimately scattered and then they would be gathered together. That's happened. I mean, we need to wake up. And if you caught the session last night, I share several verses just to show how prolific that prophecy is. And then I end with one from Jeremiah, where Jeremiah says, there's coming a time, he says, basically, how much we talk about how God brought us out of Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea and everything that happened there, everything that happened in the wilderness, all of that, constantly the prophets and everybody who would call Israel to return to God would say, look back at Egypt and what he did for us, bringing us out of Egypt. And he says, there's coming a time when we're going to basically say, forget that. Look what he's doing now. And that now has happened here. But, my kids come home all the time with coloring sheets and activity sheets of the parting of the Red Sea and of Moses and the plagues and those things. Yet we've never had a coloring sheet of how Israel has returned right before our eyes. I guess it's something I need to work on, right? And so that's where we're at. I mean, this huge thing has happened before our eyes. So, hey, any questions, hit us up. Micah, I see you in the house. Thank you. Great to see people tuning in, checking us out. So, along these lines, just questions that I typically get when I'm out sharing with this. Number one is the conflict that we have in modern day Gentile Christianity, American Christianity, that our understanding of Israel. And I'll be doing a 2-part, and I think right now it's actually probably going to expand to a 3-part because I have no time limits on online. You can watch it or not watch it, but when I do it in the church, I try to do all these in 2 sessions, which I love because I get to introduce the idea in the first session and then come back and just walk through the passages in that second session. But so I have a conference called Church We Must Get Israel Right, in which we look at the relationship to the church and in Israel. And it's something that's been skewed basically all of history, coming out of really since the 4th century, maybe even before that. We start seeing pieces of that, maybe as far back as the 2nd century. A really devastating thing that has really hurt our understanding of God, of Scripture, of just what God's unfolding, of the future, of prophecy. All of that is in question and I think misunderstood because of this just really screwed up view we have of how we interconnect with Israel. And unfortunately, for the most part, it's that we don't connect at all. That the Old Testament, you've even heard, we've had prominent leaders of today, who have come out and said, hey, Andy Stanley, one of them, I don't mind calling the name out on this because this was completely ridiculous, coming out and saying, hey, we need to unhitch ourselves from the Old Testament. No, we need to saturate ourselves in the Old Testament and then understand how the New Testament comes from that. But anyway, that's in this mindset that the Old Testament doesn't matter. And therefore, along those lines, many would say Israel doesn't matter. And then even within, and so you have the great danger, and which is the focus of what this conference, Church We Must Get Israel, is about, is the danger of a replacement theology, which is basically said the promises that Israel does not matter. They have been given now to the church, which when you say that, you're basically saying given to Gentiles. But that's not the case. I mean, if we understand God that way, that's a huge problem. But even within camps, where most places I go and speak, they love Israel. It live by, if you stand with Israel, you'll be blessed. If you don't, you'll be cursed, and stand by that. But even within that, there's all these distinctions made about Israel. I'll get done. I'll have spoke maybe this conference or another one, and have talked about Israel. Someone will catch me off the platform, and they will say that, Jake, hey, that's great you talked about Israel, but now you're talking about the spiritual Israel, right? Not the ethnic Israel or the political Israel or whatever political Israel you want to come up with there. And I think that's just really a bad thing that we've come up with all these different divisions in how we should understand Israel. I just say no. I'm talking about Israel. I'm talking about the Jewish people who have existed since Abraham. That's continued on. Now, true, most in the land today are not believers. They do not believe in Jesus as the Messiah that was promised. But when Christ returns, that will change. I wish it would change now. That would sure save a lot of the things that are coming prophetically. But why make this distinction? I think it's one of the greatest dangers that we have in our teaching. It just keeps us from understanding what's going on. There's no need for that distinction. I mean, yes, you have Jewish people who are believers. You have a small pocket of that, which is growing. And then you have those who aren't. Yes, you have Jewish people living in the land of Israel, but the promises are physical promises. They're promises of land. They're promises of a kingdom. And we as Gentiles, we're just divided in. Romans 11 says we're grafted in. Listen, we follow a Jewish king. We follow a Jewish master. We follow a Jewish religion. We're going to be in a Jewish kingdom that's going to be ruled out of Jerusalem. Our capital is going to be Jerusalem. So it's really ridiculous. We make this division out there, and it's dangerous. So that's typically the response I get. Then secondly, the thing I get is, especially when I talk about the end, how that, center stage of the end times is the Middle East. It's Israel and its neighbors, and United States really out of the picture for the most part, if anything, peripheral. We will have a two-part series coming up called The Thinnest Ice, which we talk about America's place in the end. But with that, when I share that or anything sharing about the danger that Israel will face at the end, or even what I just talked about the scene of the armies of the world encircling Israel, I have seriously had this happen 3 times. Somebody will stand up in the audience mid-sermon and say, yes, but we will never leave the side of Israel. Yeah. Yeah, we are. It's unfortunate. Don't know the full reason why the United States does that, but that happens. That's what's going to happen. I wish I had it before me. And Cherrilynn's not on here to buy time for me to look it up real quick. But there's a passage in Isaiah that talks about how that Israel will be by themselves. They will stand alone in the end. No one will stand with them. And we go back to times in the past, such as Hezekiah's rule, as the Assyrians were breathing down the neck of Judah. And Hezekiah is told not to make any of these covenants, any of these agreements, any of these treaties, and calling the other nations for help. He still continues to try and eventually just runs out of opportunities to do that. And I think that's a foreshadowing. I know it's a foreshadowing of what we will see at the end. Well, it's getting close to the second half of the show. My goodness, I have talked and talked and talked. So if you have some questions, have some comments, jump in there. Please say something. Please send me in the direction that you want to go, or I'll just pick the direction. Again, that's why I love having a host, because it gets me out of the rut, because you already heard my spiel. Hopefully you caught that. If you didn't, go back and check it out. Or if you don't have time to check it out, you can go to stanfordministries.com/you are here message, and you can get the notes, and you can just get the cliff notes and miss all the goodness of seeing the great pictures and hearing me for a long time. Again, I appreciate your support. Appreciate your support for being here. And I surely this thing's going to let me know when Chadwick's in the house. And so, Chad, if you're there, let me know. We'll let you in when you get here. Again, this is my first time in this new vehicle called StreamYard, and it's not too bad, other than it doesn't have the touch-up feature that Zoom has. So having to see me all natural. So that's no good. So yeah, stalling, looking for Chad. Anyway, any questions, pop them in here as well. But the whole point of the You Are Here conference has been to say, okay, look, we've got clear evidence that points we're way down the track, and we need to let this resonate and be okay with that. Is that a hard thing for you? I know some of the names that I see popped up here live. I know where you stand, and because you've been supporter of Stand Firm or End Time Church or some other ministries involved in, and you've come to the point where you realize you ain't crazy to say, hey, it's easy to say we're living in the end times. Oh, got a good question coming back. And so anyway, so think about that question. Is it hard for you to get over the hump and say, yes, we could be living in the end? Because I do. I have a hard time with it. Maybe it comes from just how I've looked at prophecy teaching and prophecy in the past. I've looked at it as kind of like the side circus of Bible teaching. So Taryn got a great question. How do you get your hair slick looking, Pastor Jay? Yeah, thank you for getting the ball rolling. And hey, that's fine. We stay on that surface. So this is brought to you by Spiker Hair Glue. Typically, Spiker Hair Glue comes in the second half of before I get a cutter, especially in quarantine hair. But I'm out of the other stuff. So I like to use a lighter gel to begin with. That way it's not just so heavy, and then bump up to the hair glue. So yeah, it's brought to you by Spiker. So the other day I got my, this actually probably was a few months ago, obviously a few months ago, year ago. Anyway, so I'm getting my hair did at the place, and the girl cutting my hair I said, hey, I want to, I'm doing a faux hawk deal. And she says, wait a minute, how old are you? And basically said I was too old for a faux hawk. I'm like, hey, I'm trying to hold something to make me cool. So whatever I can do with that. So any great questions like that? No? Silent? So what about coming to that point where you are okay saying, hey, this could be the end? And I think we have a danger of that because we know what is said in Matthew 24, that no one will know the time. We know that we shouldn't be setting dates. But then you also have in 2 Thessalonians, Paul says, hey, I don't want you to be ignorant about these things. In Matthew 24, Jesus says that you should be able to look and you should be able to see the signs. And just as you can see the seasons changes, you can see. So we see both. And so it's a balance there of, yes, we don't know. No one is going to know the exact time. If they say they do, or if they tell you that they can identify the number 666 and exactly who that points to, I think you also put them on the list. But anyway, if somebody is pointing to an exact date, no one knows. There's no way. That is not info that's going to be given. But at the same time, I think it's very clear that we're meant to be able to look out in the signs and say, hey, this could be it. This could be approaching that time. I think that's very valid. I think, as Paul said, you shouldn't be ignorant. Oh, questions are rolling in. Thank you, Taryn, for getting this ball rolling. Do you think the term last days can simply be applied to the time from Jesus' ascension to his return? Awesome question. That was actually a shower topic for me this morning. Do you think last days for his turn is the term just for Jesus' ascension or his return? So when we talk about end times, we're not always talking about apples to apples, right? Because some of us, when we say someone, it says end times, it's saying the full 7 years, that final 7 years, which I believe is a preferable way to say that. Final 7 years are Daniel's 70th week. Again, I think that's the approach rather than just tribulation, because I think that's a bit confusing to the Great Tribulation. But anyway, so we sometimes we're talking about all of that 7 years. End times proper, the day of the Lord, is especially the final battle and Jesus's return. That is the end of the age. That is the end of the age moment. But the term, and notice I said end of the age. I think end times is probably something we just need to throw out the window. I use it because we understand what that means, but really that's a terrible phrase. End of this age, the beginning of the next age is what's going on. And I think that's really what we should strive for as being our language. But the last days, does that include just that 7 years? Yes, I think it includes that 7 years, but I think you can back out farther than that. It's I believe you start with what we say is the birth pains, what we read about in the first part of Matthew 24. And so my shower discussion with myself was today. We know Matthew 24 is talking about the birth. The birth is what comes at the Great Tribulation. That is the birth pains. The beginning of birth pains we read about in the first part of Matthew 24. I don't believe we can say it's just those first 3.5 years. I believe we can back that off, and who knows how far you back that off, because there has to be turmoil that leads to the rise of the Antichrist. Now, not completely, maybe as some end time movies have portrayed, that there's just complete disaster. Therefore, this guy's able to step on the world stage. I don't think that, but we have to understand if he is a Middle Eastern leader that's going to rise up in a renewed caliphate, we know the turmoil just that's going to cause in the Middle East. And for that to be a world power that rises above current world powers, you're talking about quite a bit of turmoil, stuff that doesn't happen just overnight. And so, long story short, I think Last Days is encompasses the final 7 years, uh, but I think also you can back up to that. Friend Nelson Walters talks about it being a hurricane in the eye of the storm, being that great tribulation, but we're hit with bands of that hurricane beforehand. So I believe Chadwick Harvey's in the house. Let me see if I can bring you on. Ooh, I can ban you from the studio. That's not the button we want, is it? Okay. All right, we get this worked out. Talk amongst yourself there. So yeah, again, no easy answer. I apologize about that, but I think far as Last Days, we back up before that, because there has to be a turmoil time, and I think for the United States, and in a couple of conferences down the road, few weeks down the road, I'll be sharing a conference called the Thinnest Iced, where we talk about the United States, and we have to understand the United States has to at least become diminished for this rise of a Middle Eastern empire, and so I think you could even say our last days could even be before the last days. And a big point of mine and many of the guests that I will have on here is to say, hey, it's not about the West. It's not about the United States. Center stage is Israel. It's Jerusalem. It's the Middle East. But at still doing that, we have to understand that the United States still exists. There's still going to be a trajectory we're on, and that is important. Come on, Wade. We're getting some questions in. Any other questions? Try to answer it more concisely. Good to see some action going on here on the line. Hey, thank you, Taryn. I'm not too old for a faux hawk, and spelled that on point. That's something not I never am able to spell on point. So Chad's trying to get in. The door is stuck. The door is jammed. So it's having to bust through. I had the chance to call a ball game one time, a football game, and then I got brought over to try a baseball game. And I'm working with this guy, and I was just so amazed. I mean, you know how slow baseball is, but if you're a fan, that's great. But can be slow. And this guy, I mean, could talk all the details of the game, but anytime there was a down moment, he just completely filled it up. And it was so amazing. And I was just sitting there. I like totally froze and didn't do my part. I was just like in awe of this guy, just amazed. There he is.
Hey, my friend.
Chad, hear me?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you good.
How are you, bud?
Hey, I'm good. I am good. Totally disastrous show. It's just me. Our host, Cherrilynn, is out. Had a emergency come up right before we got on. And so this didn't record it live. And so I've been recording my messages live for the past 2.5 months. And so I've been able to use the edit button quite a bit. And we've worked together on a few videos, not live, and have had to do a lot of editing. So this is a disaster on my end. So I'm glad you're along to fix it up. So many of you know Chad Harvey. If you don't, you need to know him. He leads a ministry called Faithful Performance. Has 2 books out, God's Prophetic Timeline. The second, God's Fishermen, Satan's Hunters. Did I get it backwards?
That's right. God's Fishermen, Satan's Hunters.
Okay. I always get the 2 titles, the 2 names, they're backwards. But I know the fisherman's got to come first. So I try to keep that in mind. And brand new podcast, The Final Threshold. It is awesome. Dropped a new one today, right?
That's right, with Daniel Seckham, a mutual
Daniel Seckham. If you've not heard Daniel Seckham, and if you've not heard this topic, Daniel Seckham, I think he just has a download from the Lord about this understanding of how the left is really kind of like if you're playing volleyball. So Chad, I know I look like the Mr. in shape, Mr. Athlete. But so in school, I have no idea why they did this, but I was in Bible college, and they had a group of those who were, training to be pastors. It's called the Ministers Association. And so some reason as a fundraiser, they had us play the women's volleyball team. Total embarrassment, man, getting just totally smashed, there. But anyway, so with volleyball, you have the set and then the whatever it's called. But anyway, the spike. So to me, what Daniels talks about is that the left right now, that politically there is a set being done that along when the time for the Antichrist to rise and the rise of possibly Islam with that, it's almost like the spike that comes in and how they work hand in hand. And that's what the episode's about. Really catching a lot of where we are right now. Just phenomenal episode. So check that out. I noticed it was a little bit longer than your first 2.
Yeah, it kept going. It was like an hour and 45 minutes. He kept asking. I'm like, hey, this is good stuff. So let's just keep going with it. He really broke it down on the evolution of what we're seeing in America today. So please check it out. It's the cultural war. It's how the radical left is associating with Islam and connected with Islam. So it's a very informative podcast.
Very good. And again, he's the master on it. Someday he's got a book coming out on it that I can't wait with that. Chad, you have been, so last night I spoke on, it was a 2-part series on where we are prophetically, which you've written the book on it, God's Prophetic Timeline. And so in the first session, I talked about Daniel 2 and that being fulfilled historically. And then last night talked about the return of Israel. Return of Israel is in basically everything you do. It's how you start out your first book, God's Prophetic Timeline. It's really what your second book is about. So how important is the return of Israel as a prophetic sign?
So whenever we look at the end of the age and the signs of the end of the age, as you know, the first thing that comes to my mind is Israel, is the Jewish people, because of the everlasting covenant. So we know that the Abrahamic, the Davidic, and the New Covenant, they all work together with the seed of the Abrahamic covenant and the promised land. that seed will become the king of the Davidic covenant over the promised land, over the children of Israel. And then the new covenant is he will be their Messiah. That's when they will recognize him as their king and their Messiah, and he will rule over David's throne. So the new covenant actually fulfills the Abrahamic and the Davidic covenant, and that will only occur at the Messiah's return. As you know, then for 1,000 years, we will be living in the new covenant. We're all saved by the blood of the new covenant, obviously, but we will be living in the new covenant once the Jewish people accept him as their Messiah and King. So I think that end of the age, the conversation has to begin with Israel returning to the land, with the Jewish people returning to the land. And then it does set that timetable. You know, I know some people turn to Isaiah 66 and whatever the case may be, that's a foreshadow. It's not the final return that I believe is speaking of in Isaiah 66, but it is a marker that they had to come back into the land after 2,000 years, if you will. And then all these other prophecies that will occur with Israel, with the nations, will come from there. So I do believe 48 was an important marker, as most people, some people also put the fig tree in Matthew 24 as there's, you know, the sign of the fig tree, so to speak. So we have all of these signs, and when you look at that as the beginning marker of 48, and then you go to 67 when they recaptured Jerusalem, and then you look at all the other prophecies that we speak of, the Daniel prophecies of the kingdoms in Daniel 8, etc., then you're starting to see all these events, these prophecies culminate. But it does begin with Israel. As we know, they have to be in the land to fulfill most of these prophecies. Even the time of Jacob's trouble, they have to be in Israel. Antichrist comes against them. Of course, they have to be in Israel and even Jerusalem, you know, for the last 3.5 years. And as we know, Messiah will not come back until they say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So it's very important to keep up with. There's many end time signs, of course, as we all know, as you know, but the two of the major signs is Israel and also the Jewish people.
You mentioned Isaiah 66. Take us to Isaiah 66. What were you referencing to there in regards to the return?
That's when Isaiah, you know, with Isaiah 66, I mean, the prophet is almost astonished. You know, he says, "Who has heard such a thing? Who has seen such things? Can a nation be born in one day," so to speak? So there is a lot of people that believe that the 48, May 14th, 1948, which we just had the celebration here recently, that was the fulfillment of that. And then when you go into the prophecy after that, it says, "When you see these things," and then it speaks of the destruction that's coming, the Lord pours out his wrath, etc. So people point to that. They point to the fig tree as well, that's mentioned in the Olivet Discourse. And at least it's a marker, you know, whether people want to agree with Isaiah 66, at least it's a marker to understand that we're living in the end of the age.
Right. And so I mentioned in the session that I did, I mentioned back to that verse, "Can a nation be born in a day?" And I showed the newspaper clipping from that. But you're exactly right, and I've heard most people take that to mean that nation's birth. But Daniel, who you just had on your show, I heard speak probably the best on this, and he talked about, as he walked through all the birth analogies throughout the Old Testament and with the prophets, and said exactly what you said, that it's really pointing to the unfortunate part of the return is because, I mean, think of what God has given Israel. How he's preserved them over this time. He's brought them back as he said he was, but yet they've still not recognized, for the most part, will not recognize Christ, which leads us to the most unfortunate part of all of this, the time of Jacob's trouble, the Great Tribulation. I mean, really unfortunate to say, a second Holocaust in a sense, which we wish was some way to avoid, but God's plan to bring his people back. But that being the sign, the ultimate sign. In your book, God's Prophetic Timeline, you begin with the comment about this possibly being the terminal generation. And again, that seems to be a lot connected with Isaiah 66 and this birth and things like that. What do you, when you talk about the terminal generation, what do you mean by that?
Yes, it's a scripture that's mentioned in Psalms 102, verse 16 and 18, and I'll summarize it for you. It says, "For when the Lord builds up Zion, he will appear in his glory." And then it goes on to say, "This is written for the generation to come. So in the Hebrew, that word is akaron, for generation to come, and it means terminal or last. So that's where it comes from, where when we see Zion being built up, and obviously since 1967, the Lord has built up Zion. You know, the desert's blooming. You look at the medicine, the Israelis. I mean, it's incredible what they're doing over there with technology, etc. So he certainly has built up Zion. So in my opinion, it goes back into the terminal generation of what the Hebrew word is for the generation to come. So that's where it comes from. But also in what I did include in the book, and I gathered more information as time has gone by with studying, is the days of creation. So we can take that 1967 point, or 1948 as well, and we can look at the days of creation as prophetic. And I've gone over that in the past on videos, but basically they're very prophetic. The 7 days of 7,000 years, 2 Peter 3:8, a day is 1,000 years, 1,000 years is a day. Psalms 90, they're pointing us back to the days of creation. So most would believe that from Adam to Messiah has been 4,000 completed years, or 4 completed days, and obviously from Messiah to now is almost 2,000 completed days, or 2 completed days. So it's not to set dates or anything, but we're given these prophecies to understand, just like the time of Jacob's trouble, it's going to be set the last 7 years, and then the 3.5 years is when they really speak of the Great Tribulation. So he does give us markers in place to understand, not to set dates, but just to follow the pattern, go along the road, go along the journey, and we will understand the times once we understand Daniel's 70th week, the days of creation, 48, 67, the 4 kingdoms, the Antichrist kingdom. All of these things that he's given us are for us to understand these, so we're not in the dark.
I love how you do this. If anybody follows you, they need to follow your videos, because you do such a great job walking through the Hebrew calendar. I mean, really how God keeps time with the feast and those things. But what you bring up is the fact that this millennial kingdom would be that millennium of rest, and it keeps that same pattern that God keeps throughout. The 7 days of creation, where you have the 6 days, and the 7th day he rests, the Sabbath, the sabbatical year, the year of Jubilee. I mean, all of this, and when we're right along that, the Jewish calendar, as far as years, counts down, or it's just counting up. And I know me and you had a conversation about this not too long ago. I was asking you, I mean, we feel like possibly the years that the Jewish calendar kind of says now is maybe not accurate. Is that right? But it's a countdown. Right. I mean, if you see it, it's in the late 5000s of that, but it's not certain that's quite on track with that.
Yeah. So yeah, if I could mention one more thing, even we talked about that, and even if you don't even look at the 7-day creation plan, which I believe is very important, you can go to Hosea. Hosea 6, it says, after 2 days, he's speaking about the Messiah returning. After 2 days, he will restore us. He will revive us. And on the 3rd day, we will live in his presence. So he's speaking about the coming Mashiach, the Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus, coming after 2,000 years. And then the 3rd day, the 3,000th year, which is the 7,000th year of the days of creation, that's when we will be living in the millennial kingdom.
That's why I love visiting with Chad. He's got such an insight on just connecting the timelines and those things. You wrote the book, God's Prophetic Timeline. Your second book, God's Fishermen, Satan's Hunters, talks about the return of Israel, but refers to a really kind of obscure prophecy that really paints the picture of what's going on. Could you speak to that?
Sure. Yeah, the prophecy, the book, actually, the prophecy was supposed to be written in God's prophetic timeline. And my mother, she always reads my books before they go into the editing. And she was like, hey, I think you need to pull this out, because it was only like 3,500 words, one chapter. And you're an author, so you know the type of words and stuff. So anyhow, moms know best, as you know. So I was like, okay, well, I don't know where you're going with this. So the book turned into 80,000 words after it was said and done. So the prophecy basically states in Jeremiah 16, it says that no longer the Lord will be called the God of Egypt, or the God who took the Israelites out of Egypt, but he will be called the God who took the Israel out of all 4 parts of the world, so to speak, from the north and from all the surrounding areas. And then he goes on to tell us how he's going to do this. He says he's going to do it by the fishermen. He's going to bring the fishermen to catch them back, to fish them back, and then afterward he'll send the hunters to hunt them and provoke them back to the promised land. So we have to understand this prophecy, and it's different from Jeremiah 23. When you read Jeremiah 16 and Jeremiah 23, they're the exact same language with what I mentioned before, but the Jeremiah 23, it says, and he led them back. So Jeremiah 23 is speaking about the Messiah's return, and then he's going to gather them from when the Antichrist spreads them into captivity, etc. Zechariah, half the city goes into captivity, etc. So he's going to lead them back. So when we read those, it's two different prophecies in my mind that they're very close to each other. But the Jeremiah 16 prophecy of the fishermen and the hunters had to have a marker that would begin that. And I personally believe that the Israelis are the fishermen, the Jewish people are the elect, according to Romans 11. They're going to be the ones who fish their people back home. Okay, David Ben-Gurion, the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish Agency, etc. We have a friend, Chaim Malspin, that's doing the Aliyah Return Center as well. So he's a fisherman. They're going to fish their people back, and then they will send the hunters, or then he will send the hunters afterwards. So we have to ask ourselves, when would that be? When would the fishermen have been released to fish them back? Well, it just makes logical sense, not only logical but biblical sense, that they can't fish their people back until they are state again, until 1948. And since that time, since 1948, over 4 million, approximately 4 million Jewish people have made Aliyah, or returning back to the promised land. So I believe Jeremiah 16, the fisherman part, has started to be fulfilled in 1948, and I think it will continue until the midway point of the tribulation, because as we know, Messiah tells them to flee from the mountains, so he's not wanting them to fish the people back to Israel, Jerusalem, because he's telling them to flee. So there's a conflict there with understanding. So, and then let's look at the hunters. The hunters, in my opinion, we can make the case that they were released in 2014 and 2015, and it goes back into what I wrote in the book about some of the celestial signs in the skies and how these patterns have occurred with the migration or the Aliyah of the Jewish people on the blood moon tetrads in 1492, 1948, 1967, and then we have the one in 2014, 2015 on the Lord's feast days, that we saw the Islamic invasion into Europe, you know, from the civil unrest and the wars going on in the Middle East, Syria, etc. And then they've come into Europe, and you look what's happened. There was a massive aliyah from the European countries during 2014 and 2015 and on forward, because of the anti-Semitism and the terror, the war that's been going on since that time, or not war, but terror going on during that time with the Islamic invasion. So I believe that we can make the case that on the blood moons, on the 2014, 2015, that the hunters were being released into Europe, and now I believe they're going to come to America. They're going to come to America after that, because we have to understand that two of the largest Jewish populations are in Europe and America. America being number 2, Europe being number 3, and specifically France being number 3. Well, if you look at France during that time, 2014, 2015, it was a disaster. You know, you had terror all over the country during that time. So I don't think it's coincidence that we're seeing these blood moons, we're seeing the Aliyah return, we're seeing the fishermen in 48, we're seeing the hunters being released. And now when you look at America, what's going on in America with the Islamic political invasion, the cultural invasion. You look at Michigan, you look at Minnesota, you look at you look at the Congress with the 3 Islamic radicals, and in the Congress, the women who are openly anti-Semitic. They hate Israel openly. You know, who would have thought that? So what we're seeing is this political jihad, because you will eventually see the anti-Semitism in America reach a point of no return. And you're starting to see that even with President Trump in office. You're seeing California, you're seeing New York, Pittsburgh, you're seeing all these anti-Semitic cases going on. And I think that's only going to ramp up. And personally, I think with the coronavirus, you know, every time something happens on the globe, the Jews are responsible, right? The Jewish people are always the one that people blame, so to speak. So I think you're going to continue to see it ramp up through the times that we're living in, because according to Jeremiah's prophecy, they have to return to the land. And that goes into other prophecies with Ezekiel 38, knowing that the Antichrist knows that they are safe in the land. He knows they're back in the land if you read the prophecy carefully. So I believe Ezekiel 38, Jeremiah 16 kind of correlates together. And I think it's very important for all of us to stand beside the Jewish people.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I'll be talking about next in the next session, I'm talking about the Islamic understanding of the Antichrist, and it's something we haven't got into in the sessions I've been leading. But when you put that together, as you have in this book, with the return of Israel, I mean, those two things happening, it's unbelievable what we're seeing before our eyes, and looking out at what's happening. Going back to 2011, the Arab Spring. I mean, you had this just an explosion of these changes in the Middle East. That's all pushing back to this revival of the caliphate, all running side by side. Again, very clear evidence. A very fascinating book, and when you read it, you're just seeing these things unfold. I encourage people to check it out. You write about a lot, and you've mentioned already a lot about God's time measures, and I want, before you get off here, I want to get people in touch with you of how they can get your videos and stay in tune, because you just do such a great job talking about the Hebrew calendar, the feast, and how that connects. And I think in our world, we just think that none of that matters. But this is like God, how He set up His calendar. I mean, if you keep a planner online, in paper form, whatever it is, you may have your own way of doing things. God designed this. So what does that tell us, or how can we utilize that to understand where we are prophetically?
Yes, I think it's very paramount for all of us to understand God's calendar. I mean, He has a certain calendar that He uses, and He describes that in Genesis 1:14, and what that the requirements of the calendar is the sun and the moon. So the Hebrew Jewish calendar is the only calendar that uses the sun and the moon. Our calendar, the Roman calendar, only uses the sun only, and the Islamic calendar only uses the moon only. So God said His calendar is the sun and the moon, and it's the Hebrew Jewish calendar. And once we understand the calendar, all of these prophecies start to make sense. Even the rapture, people, it's the highly debated topic, and I'm about to do a video on the rapture. Well, it begins with the calendar. If we don't understand the calendar and the feast days, then you really can't understand totally the rapture, in my personal opinion, because it goes on with all the other prophecies. But using God's calendar, being on His calendar, of course, we have to use the Gregorian calendar. That's how we work and stuff. But it goes to the fact what you were mentioning. He's the boss. So could you imagine telling your boss, if he says, I want to meet you at 1 o'clock on Saturday, and you meet him 1 o'clock on Monday? Well, you're off time. You're probably going to be fired, so to speak. So God's the same way. He's the boss. He has a calendar in place, and it's very important. It goes with the prophecies. It goes with the feast days. Actually, the word in the calendar that He uses for seasons in Genesis 1:14 is moed, and it's the same word that's in the feast days of the Lord in Leviticus 23. So His calendar is for the appointed times. It's for divine appointments. Really, feast is that's what it means. It means a divine appointment, moed, fixed times, appointed times, and they are for Messiah's first coming events and also His second coming events. And so it's extremely important for us to understand. And I think it's one of the reasons where He is elevating His feast days at this time that we're living in on 2020. In my personal opinion, when you look at the exact template that we're on, we've talked about it with the Exodus template of the first Exodus. We're doing the same thing. We're quarantined. He's broken all the idols, etc. So He's really elevated His feast days, in my opinion, right now. But it's important for us to understand this because it goes back into understanding the rapture, or the time of Jacob's trouble will be on the Feast of Trumpets. It will end on the Feast of Trumpets. The wedding of the Messiah, all of these things that are in the Hebraic understanding, the Jewish understanding. And like I tell people, we have to remember Jesus is a Jew. He was a Jewish man. He's a Jewish Messiah. It's going to be Jewish. We're all grafted into this, and we have to have a Jewish understanding and how He would have related to the Jewish disciples and others in the text, with some of the idioms and some of the slang that, He's not going to talk South Georgia or Northwest Arkansas. Okay. So,
right.
But anyhow, so
He doesn't have the SEC bias, or he does, but it's just below the Jewish bias.
That's right. It's secondary. So we have to understand it in that way, and it's important to get into the calendar. You don't have to be an expert on it, but have a basic understanding, and then we can relate it to the Gregorian calendar. Once we understand Nisan 14 or Tishri 1 or Tishri 10, we can understand where the spring and the fall feast days are, because that's when He's going to return, as those fall feast days, just like He fulfilled the first spring feast days of Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, and Shavuot, Pentecost, which we're about to see here in about 9 days at Pentecost. But he's going to fulfill the second coming events as well. And once we start to understand the calendar and understand the way that he operates, and then we go to the biblical prophecies, it's just totally amazing where the clarity and the purity, if you will, of the scriptures come into play.
You've got such a handle on it. I try to glean more from you every time I'm around you on this subject. But as you said, I mean, you're from Georgia. I'm from Arkansas. We're prototypical Bible Belt guys here who grew up knowing the Lord, church, but this whole Jewish calendar thing, I don't know about you, but it never crossed my mind. Never was taught. Never. I in Bible college, in seminary, all of that, it just never was made to be a factor. And as I began studying prophecy, Mark Blitz, a guy that we both have followed and kept up with, who also teaches on these feasts. I think he has a book called God's Daytimer. Hearing him talk about Jesus fulfilling the feast when he's here, the first Advent fulfilled the spring feast. When he returns, he will fulfill the fall feast. And that just began to trigger something in me. And so I've been on a journey hoping to follow that. But as you said, keeping it in front of us. One of the things, just simple things I've done just on a practical matter is I've just plugged in the dates on my phone. And so I get an alarm because I'm not thinking, necessarily I am more so, but hearing that go off and know, okay, this is going on. And my wife, I hear that alarm go off and she'll say, now what Jewish time is this? That's kind of the response, but it's helped us bring it more to our family. We're trying to work towards celebrating the feast more, just as a family, trying to do the best we can, at least talk about it and those things. And again, it's nothing we have to do. But I think we've got, what we read in Galatians and what we read elsewhere in Scripture, we just want to jump to, okay, that's all old. We don't have to do any of that. Well, this is, again, from the Lord. This is what he laid out. And really, I think we'd be in a lot better shape if we followed that, practiced that, kept up that, because it reminds us of the past, teaches about who God is, and points us to the future. So encourage them to check you out in that. And I don't have a lot of time. We're basically out of time, but I wanted to ask this question because it's really your first book, God's Prophetic Timeline, really deals with this. So in the previous session 1 of the You Are Here conference, I talk about the Daniel 2 being fulfilled as historical kingdoms, which I know you wouldn't be opposed to that, but you also write about these also being fulfilled in the last days as reemerging kingdoms. Could you speak to that before I let you off the hook today?
Sure. Yeah. As you know, we both have been looking into the Daniel prophecies with all the people that we've networked. And Daniel 2 is an interesting chapter when I read it, and I look at Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 and see weigh those two passages out. And when you look at Daniel 2, so what we're speaking of is, yes, there's a historical fulfillment. And then what I totally believe is on 2 points is, number one, I believe that things redo, they come again. They always repeat themselves. So I think Solomon said that what has been is what will be. What has been done will be done. There's nothing new under the sun. And Isaiah, God declares the end from the beginning, from ancient times not yet fulfilled in Isaiah 46. So I believe that whether you're looking at these, the main thing with the Daniel 2 is to have the geography correct. That's the main thing, is to have the geography correct. And then it gets to these debates where I just like to talk to people and just to get their opinion, because if we're looking at an Islamic kingdom, then we're all going to be right on the geography. But if it's a Roman thing, then you're off, in my personal opinion. But then when we get to where we're splitting hairs, so to speak, whether it's historical, whether it's at the end of the age, you can look at and make the case for both, actually, because I reread that before we came on with you again, because you can always reread and gain new insight. And Daniel 2:28 says this: he wanted to make Nebuchadnezzar understand what was going to happen in the latter days, the end of the age in Daniel 2:28, and Daniel 2:44, it says, in the days of these kings that the stone was going to come. So I personally look at it like, yes, it was fulfilled back with Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, and also Alexander, but then there's this huge gap. So could it mean that we have these four kingdoms rise again at the end? When it says in the days of these kings, now then someone would say that believes it's historical would say, well, the 10 toes are the kings he's speaking of. Well, he didn't label those kings in the passage. He labels those toes, which I believe they are kings, obviously, as well. They're symbolic for kings. But it just makes you wonder, are we going to see this pattern of these four kingdoms rise again? And I wrote the first book on that I believe that I was leaning towards Iraq being the fulfillment of the first, and Iran, and you can see Iran right now, and then you have the Turkey kingdom coming. So no matter the case may be, it's important to have the geography right first, because whenever we look at Daniel 2, we'll understand the 10 kings if we understand the geography is correct. If it's wrong, then I don't believe you will understand, because the geography is inaccurate.
It's very hard to move me from a position I held to something new. I'm stubborn. I have to really work through it and be convinced by the text. One thing that is completely convincing, as you mentioned, Daniel 2:28 and Daniel, the other passage you mentioned, they both talk about this happening in the later days. And you see the same sentiment in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, and which all of that. I think that here's historical clarity is there, but the language is definitely there that these are going to happen in the end times. And I was thinking through that before we went on today, because I knew I was going to have this discussion with you. Because I think also you can, and also I don't know if you caught Joel Richardson, who has been very vocal about Daniel 8 being presented consistently futuristic, released a Bible study where he backtracked on that. And I agreed with a lot of the points that he made on the backtrack. And so it's really, which he didn't rule out the futuristic view, but did backtrack some on it. And so I was really wrestling with that this past week. And really, you could take Daniel 2, Daniel 7 off the grid when we're talking about what's coming at the end. And as we read the other passages, about the rise of the Antichrist and him coming out of the Middle East, and these 10 nations coming together, 4-3 coming out of that, then down to 1, and what that geography would be, as you said, it all puts us in the same thing. There's going to be a struggle within those lands. Are going to be a part of it, and therefore they're going to be part of the struggle of the rise. And so I think, elsewhere in Scripture clearly lays out that that's going to happen. And so I think, again, when you plug in that language of the later times, I don't think we're off track by any means to say these are going to reemerge. And that foreshadowing, that's one of the things throughout Scripture that's just you just see over and over. I shared last night in the session, as we talk about that final vision of what's going to happen at the end of the age as the Antichrist, the armies of the world, coming up against Israel. And then I put up an image of the Assyrian siege, how that they were, in Hezekiah's time, Jerusalem was encircled. Put up an image from the Babylonian siege, of Jerusalem, the Roman siege, and you could actually throw in a couple of Roman sieges. And it's the same image. It's just going to be on a grander scale. And so I love what you said. This is just kind of reemerging, which is completely off track. We just recently rewatched C.S. Lewis's The Lion King, the Narnia Chronicles. There we go. With the kids, the movies. Now, unfortunately, I've not read the books. I know I need to be thrown off the air with that. And I think it was the second movie, so I don't know if this is in the book. And so if somebody's watching, they can maybe set me straight. It has Aslan saying, "No thing happens the same twice." And I was really let down if that's in the book, because God's a God of patterns. I mean, he's the master author of foreshadows and all of those things. Well, Chad, loved the conversation. Loved having you on here. And because when I get the chance to just sit down and visit with you, I always like to pick your brain. So I want to do that online. I didn't send you this question ahead of time, and so I just want to try to derail you here. And so in the two presentations that I made, The first one I said in Daniel 2, and my theological term is that we're in the toe jam of that statue. So historically, so I shared that that we can look back at the Arab Spring of 2011 as maybe the push towards the final, the arrival of these 10 kings and all that at the end. But going back before that, I said that the legs would have ended at the after World War One as the Ottoman Empire is dissolved. We have the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which divides up the Middle East. But if you take that at the same time that's going on, you have the Balfour Declaration, which basically set the tone for the return of Israel, happening at the exact time. I don't know. Have you touched on that? Because to me, that's just kind of amazing how you see both of these events happening at the same time. You've got kind of the positioning of the rise of those nations listed in Babylon, but then you also have kind of the way being paved for Israel to rise up again and return.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting conversation, and I'll look at it, and it goes back to Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. And like I said, these conversations, if you're looking in the right geographical area, the Middle East and North Africa, this is all going to be very clear, whether it's historical, whether it's futuristic, and that's why, I do have I lean towards the end times, the end of the age for all these things to happen. But at the same time, I'm not opposed to someone like yourself or Joe or whoever saying, hey, this is historical, and then it bleeds into the 10 kings. Okay, I'm fine with that as long as we're looking, at the right geography. And to your point, whenever you look at what Turkey is doing, which is where most people that we network with would say, hey, this is where we need to watch. He's gone into Libya, which is one of the 10 kings, according to Daniel 11, 40 through 43. Egypt, Libya, and Sudan. So he's gone into Libya, and I've read some articles recently about what he's doing there. He's being opposed by the EU and all these things, and he just doesn't care. And I think with the coronavirus, I'm talking about Erdogan, the president of Turkey, he just doesn't care. And I believe he's using the coronavirus, and he's going into Libya really strong. So to your point, we're starting to see these 10 kings start to shape up. And the only thing that would concern me with looking at Daniel 8 and 2 and 7 in a historical manner is in Ezekiel 38, we have Persia that's underneath Turkey. And right now they're above Turkey. Just when you look at the Middle East, they are the superpower. Most people would believe they are the superpower of the Middle East that keeps up with that area. So there's something that's going to happen, whether it's Daniel 8 and it's going to be fulfilled right now or in the coming years, or something will happen with the shift of power, whatever it may be. So I'm looking at that, and I might not have answered your question, but I do see Israel rising. I do see the Jewish people going back to Israel. I do seeing them mostly. Jeremiah doesn't say specifically how many, but I would assume the majority, if not all, will be provoked back through the hunters, etc. The fishermen will bring them back as well. But I do see Israel rising, and you do see the 10 kings rising for this epic, once-in-a-lifetime battle that will culminate with the return of Jesus the Messiah.
Now, you make a great point about where Ezekiel places Persia, Iran. I mean, that is a very great point. And no, I'm not throwing Daniel 8, the futuristic view, out at all. But I do feel strongly, too, that we can look at historically. I think you see both, as you've said. I think that both over there, and we see that. But yeah, that's a great point. And that's something that I actually touched on in the session, that it's really rare to find folks who are saying Ezekiel 38, 39 is the same as the Battle of Armageddon, which is crazy to me. It's crazy to me why somebody's first response would say, oh, well, this must be another battle. And let's stick with, anytime it brings up a battle at the end, let's stick with Armageddon unless Scripture tells you to go somewhere else.
I agree with you. I think all the prophets had this unique ability to speak about the end time battle in their unique way, and it all points to that one time. I agree.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's crazy to go somewhere else with it. Well, Chad, I've kept you over time. I love the chance to connect, and we're gonna have to do this again. And so I have you back, and we'll do this again on another subject. But Chad, Chad's leader of a ministry called Faithful Performance. His books are God's Prophetic Timeline, God's Fishermen, and Satan's Hunters. Where's the best place for them to find your books at?
Yeah, they can order it online through Amazon. They can also go to my website. I believe I have it both books as a discount and cheaper than Amazon. So you can go either place to get it. I'm not sure what the delivery times on Amazon. I might beat them on delivery time, but you can always check it out on both places. Feel free to contact me at chat@faithfulperformance.com. And always you can visit us on the website and also the YouTube page, Faithful Performance.
And catch his podcast, The Final Threshold. It's good. Very good stuff. I hear you got a good guest coming up here pretty soon.
I've got a great
book called
guest.
Spiritual Prepper. So
That's right.
I know at least one good show coming up. No, fabulous stuff. And Chad, you mentioned your YouTube page. Chad regularly releases teaching videos. Do this by email. I think that's the best way to do it. How can they sign up for your email list? I mean, I know so many ministries have email lists, and we just try to get them out of our inbox as fast as we can. Chad's one you want to star. Gives you great videos, gives you insight on that. How can we get on your list?
Yeah, you can go to the website, and then it has a place you can sign up, and then you'll get the emails. I use MailChimp, and you'll get weekly emails or bi-weekly emails with the podcast starting The Final Threshold. It's really weekly. I usually do a video every 2 weeks or so. I've got a new one coming out on the rapture, I believe, next week. We have the Galilee Awakening Wave 2, which you're familiar with. That's coming up, Shavuot Pentecost. So we'll have a couple good videos on that, and then we'll have this guy named Jake McCandless on next week. I think on Friday I'll be releasing that podcast about Jake, and it was a great podcast as well. So feel free to reach out to us anytime, but you'll be receiving The Final Threshold and also the videos on Faithful Performance.
Well, Chad, thank you. Thank you for being on Talking Stand Firm and riding this rough ship throughout, and covered some great stuff. And so if you were on here, please maybe share the video. If you're on Facebook watching this, get word out. Hey, thank you for supporting Stand Firm. Thank you for coming along. So next Thursday night, we will begin a 2-part series called A Liar is Coming, and looking at the rise and the origin of the Antichrist, the possible Islamic roots of that, the deception of the Antichrist. So be sure to check that out. And then we'll do this again next Friday, talking Stand Firm, 11 a.m. if you're in Central Time, like me and Chad. But many of you, I know, on the East Coast there, it's at noon. And if you're somewhere else, you're going to have to plug it in and figure it out. But I hope you can get on and check us out. Chad, thank you. And everybody, thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.